Okay, well, thanks for coming, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Dario Perinetti from the Université de Québec or Montréal. And I would consider Dario to be one of the leading Hume scholars in the world, but that is to define him too narrowly, as he has also written also on rationalists as well as Hume. He has, in fact, a book co-authored with other authors, Frankel and Smith, on the rationalists between tradition and revolution, and another book on the phenomenology of Hegel. So he's also a well-known Hegel scholar, and he has a current project on Grotius and Pufendorf. Is that right?
That's a future project. Yeah.
Okay, a future project, but I've heard him present on it, so I know it's more actual than potential at this stage.
Yeah.
But at the moment, he's working on a manuscript on Hume, and this is part of that manuscript on Hume and skepticism and the concept of mind in Hume. And so we're very privileged today to have part of that project being presented to us. Thank you, Dario.
Oh, thank you, Deb. Thank you. And thank you for having me. And as I said, I think I have been perhaps in the same room exactly 10 years ago. So I'm glad to be back here and talk a bit about Hume. Though this is, as Deborah said, part of a project, and I've been working on that in Sydney and here. So I'm using this time to work on that, and I'm glad to present some of the results. It's part of a big project in a manuscript book in which I want to argue that Hume was both a radical skeptic, and because he was a radical skeptic, he was a constructive skeptic. So that it doesn't, so these two things can go together, and that Hume and the working title of the book, it's Hume's Skeptical Solutions, which is an expression Hume used in the inquiry, so that he was in the business of not only framing skeptical problem, but also of offering solutions that were themselves skeptical in a way that needs to be explained. I hope I will be able to do that later. So, but today I'm going to talk about Hume's perceptions, and I want to suggest something that is not the ordinary way of understanding what Hume says about perceptions, namely that they are mind independent. So I will also, because English is not my first language, perhaps not my second language neither, so for your sake, I will read the paper rather than try to find the proper words and have a 3 hours long talk. So I will be talking about 50 minutes and then we can move to Q&A. Okay, so at first sight, Hume's account of the basic components of our cognitive and emotional life is pretty straightforward. He claimed, and I'm quoting him, nothing is ever present to the mind but perceptions. Then, as is well known, among these perceptions, Hume distinguished between impressions and ideas, which can be either simple or complex. Impressions fall into two categories: impressions of sensation, which comprise all sensory perceptions, and impressions of reflection, which encompass passions, desires, and emotions. Both in the treatise and in the first inquiry, Hume also advanced what he took to be the first principle of the science of human nature, and that is usually called in the literature the copy principle. And I quote him, "All our simple ideas in the first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent." It is largely accepted that by endorsing these commitments, Hume was, as a classic reader of Hume, Norman Kemp Smith, also Barry Stroud and Robert Fowling suggested, he was, I quote Barry Stroud, I think, uncritically wedded to the way of our ideas, so to Descartes' theory of ideas. So most of the major interpretations of Hume say that basically what Hume developed was a variant of the Cartesian or the Lockean theory of ideas. On a more considered view, however, Hume's account of the basic elements of the mind is neither straightforward nor a minor variation on Descartes or Locke's theory of ideas. For Hume is also intent in stressing the difference with his predecessors. In a note to the opening paragraph of Book 1, Part 1 of the treatise, he underscores the novelty of his terminology and classification while not being very clear about how exactly it differs from previous one. And you have the quote in handout 1. Hume says, I here make use of the terms impression and idea in a sense different from what is usual. And I hope this liberty will be allowed me. Perhaps I rather restore the word idea to its original sense from which Mr. Locke had perverted it in making it stand for all our perceptions. By the term impression, I would not be understood to express the manner in which our lively perceptions are produced in the soul, but merely the perceptions themselves, for which there is no particular name, either in English or any other language that I know of. So Hume decided to call perceptions what Locke and Descartes called ideas. Now, his terminological choice, as well as Hume's use of the terms, makes it often unclear whether by perceptions he means perceivings or percepts. One is also left wondering what original sense of impression and idea Hume had in mind, and what is so particular or new about Humean impressions that there is no word in any of the languages Hume knows that properly signifies it. As we can see, and as Donald Ainsley, a well-known Hume scholar, puts it, I quote him, Hume is frustratingly ambiguous about the fundamental items in his theory of mind, that is, perceptions. The purpose of my talk today is to challenge a widespread assumption among readings of Hume. The mentalistic assumption, as I will call it, holds that perceptions are intrinsically mental items. After clarifying the different senses in which perceptions could be said to be mental, I will argue that though Hume was interested in perceptions as they are related to minds, he nevertheless took them to be separable from the mental acts that target them, and more generally from the mind itself. Rather than intrinsically mental items, perceptions will be shown to be mind-independent entities in the strongest possible way. For, or so I will argue, perceptions don't need the mind in order to exist, nor are they necessitated by the mind or causally dependent on it. Thus, and contrary to the widespread mentalistic assumption, I will contend that Humean perceptions are neither intrinsically nor necessarily mental. So it seems unproblematic to assume that, and you have that in handout 2, a Humean perception is something that is inherently mental, something that necessarily is related to, a state of, or an act of the mind. So understood, perceptions are relative entities. They are entities partially constituted by the relation to a mind, so that without that relation, they simply cannot be. On this view, hence, perceptions imply perceivers. Everything Hume has written in the opening lines of the treatise and in section 2 of the first inquiry seems to underlie this apparently obvious reading of perceptions as mental things. Most readers of Hume have adopted this obvious reading and have characterized perceptions as inherently mental entities. Norman Kemp Smith, for instance, interpreted impressions to be, I quote him, subjective perishing existence inseparable from the mind of this or that individual, end of quote. Similarly, Henry Allison holds that they are mental particulars. Wayne Waxman claims that, quote, I quote him, perceptions themselves can be conceived to exist only in relation to some consciousness, end of quote. David Landy, another Hume scholar, takes Hume to claim that, I quote him, what appears to consciousness is necessarily mental and can be known to be such, end of quote. Others believe that perceptions are mental states. Some, like John P. Wright, claim that perceptions are mental acts. Yet others argue, like Don Ensley, that perceptions are at once both mental acts and the mental objects or contents of those acts. Although these interpreters may disagree widely about the way these mental items should be characterized, these readers agree in treating perceptions as intrinsically mental, and share therefore what I call the mentalistic assumption. The mentalistic assumption is the assumption that perceptions are necessarily mental. I call it an assumption because it is mostly implicit in many works on Hume and rarely explicitly stated or argued for. To understand the scope of the mentalistic assumption, it is important to be clear about what it is meant when perceptions are said to be mental, when you use the word mental to characterize perceptions. So sometimes, and you have that in handout 3, by being mental, it is meant being mind-like or partaking of the nature of the mind. Does everyone have? Okay. Or as opposed to that of material and extended things. Sometimes we refer to something being mental because it exists only in the mind as opposed to existing only outside the mind. In other cases, we understand by being mental, being mind-dependent, as opposed to being mind-independent. So the expression being mental can also stand for being related to a mind. That's another acceptation of the expression. And in a loose sense, being related to the mind can mean any of the previous acceptations, and thus it is as equivocal and unhelpful as the expression being mental. But in a strict sense, being related to a mind can be understood to refer to sense D here, something that is really distinct from the mind, and hence mind-independent, but that may actually have or possibly acquire a relation to it. The sense D is a kind of relation we obtain when we bracket all assumptions about the nature of the objects of mental acts. Being a non-essential part of the mind, like a remembered event, or being the object of an act of thinking, like the thoughts I'm trying to convey to you now, are mental in this sense, in sense D. Absent assumptions about the nature of these objects, the relation to minds need to be considered as contingent, not as necessary. It is important to know that the mentalistic assumption holds for any use of mental in the sense A, B, and C. So in sense A, B, and C are to me versions of what I call the mentalistic assumptions. Because the relation to a mind is tended to be contingent, only sense D falls outside the scope of the mentalistic assumption. Readers of Hume who implicitly or explicitly endorse the mentalistic assumption often neglect to consider that everything Hume says about perceptions in the opening sections of the treatise must be understood in light of what he says elsewhere about the nature of the mind. Now, as is well known, in the treatise, Hume rejects as unintelligible the thesis that the mind is a substance, either material or immaterial, in which thoughts or ideas could be said to inhere or to be its modes. So he rejects as unintelligible the idea that we can form a coherent conception of the support of our mental life. He also claims that the mind is nothing but a bundle of perceptions, and that, and I quote Hume, they are the successive perception only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented or the materials of which it is composed. Thomas Reid, one of Hume's friendly adversaries in Scotland, was the first to realize that Hume's skepticism about substantial minds and about the self has devastating consequences for the theory of ideas, the most damaging of which being that ideas can no longer be thought to be in the mind and that they can no longer function as mental representations of things. So I'm quoting Thomas Reid in handout 4. Reid says, Descartes, Malebranche, and Locke, as they made much use of ideas, treated them handsomely and provided them indecent accommodation, lodging them either in the pineal gland or in the pure intellect or even in the divine mind. They moreover clothed them with a commission and made them representatives of things which gave them some dignity and character. But the treatise of human nature, though no less indebted to them, seems to have made but a bad return by bestowing upon them this independent existence, since thereby they are turned out of house and home and set adrift in the world without a friend or connection, without a rag to cover their nakedness. So that's Thomas Reid. Hume, and of course, Reid found that this was a logical, the logical conclusion of the theory of ideas, but something utterly absurd. Hume makes some very odd claims that seem to confirm Reid's worry. For example, Hume claims that, I quote him, the name perception and the name object stand for the very same thing. So perceptions and objects are the same kind of thing. It is tempting to explain away this perplexing claim by arguing that Hume's use of the term object is more often than not equivocal. And some people have argued that. But the claim that the term object and the term perceptions are synonymous is not a passing remark. He repeats it in many other places in the treatise. So he comes back to that again and again. Another of Hume's odd claims is that perceptions strike or enter the mind as if they were external to it or not always in the mind. For example, and you have that in handout 5, in treatise 1121, he writes, an impression first strikes upon the senses and makes us perceive heat or cold, thirst or hunger, pleasure or pain of some kind or other. The mentalistic assumption would have led us to expect him to write that an external object strikes upon the senses and makes us have an impression of heat or cold, etc., not that the impression causes the sensation. It's striking to use the word because I always shared the mentalistic assumption until recently. So I never remarked that because you read quickly this passage and you don't see what exactly he's saying. So similar in treatise 142, he stresses again that, I quote him, everything that enters the mind is in reality, he underscores reality, a perception. For example, he also claims that, quote him, properly speaking, it is not our body we perceive when we regard our limbs and members, but certain impressions which enter by the senses, end of quote. That's 1429. In the first inquiry, Hume even asserts that, and I'm quoting him again, these things, ideas, not impressions, ideas of color enter by the eye, or those of sound are conveyed by the ear. Not only he does frequently write that impressions enter, make their way, or are conveyed, these are his expressions, to the mind, Hume also makes similar claims about ideas. The language of striking or entering the mind intimates, of course, that perceptions may not always be in it. Hume also advances claims that are at odds with another important aspect of the mentalistic assumption. The Cartesian claim that, unlike material bodies, mental entities are not extended and so have no spatial properties. Although Hume does assert that some perceptions may, as he puts it, exist nowhere and so don't have allocation in space, he clearly claims that other perceptions are extended and have therefore spatial properties. Here is not the place to explain or motivate each of these seemingly strange Humean claims, but I hope these assertions are sufficient to cast serious doubts on the apparently obvious reading or on the obviousness of the mentalistic reading of perceptions as being necessarily mental in sense A and C in the list above, or necessarily located in the mind as in sense B in the list you have of the meanings of being mental. One can again brush aside Hume's odd assertion as being muddled by poorly chosen metaphors, but there is direct and strong evidence that Hume takes perceptions to be at least possibly non-mental. He repeatedly claims that since we can think of perceptions without thinking about the mind that perceives them, it is not impossible to conceive a mind-independent perception. By way of an inference from conceivability to possibility, Hume concludes that it's not absolutely impossible for perceptions to also exist without being in the mind or being perceived. This means that it is conceivable and hence possible for a perception to be outside the mind. And you have that in handout 6. We may observe that what we call a mind is nothing but a heap or collection of different perceptions, says Hume, united together by certain relations and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. Now, as every perception is distinguishable from another and may be considered as separately existent, it evidently follows that there is no absurdity in separating any particular perception from the mind, that is, in breaking off all its relations with that connected mass of perceptions which constitute a thinking being. End of quote. So, elsewhere, Hume also makes the claim that the existence of perceptions is neither dependent on a material nor on an immaterial substantial support. Arguing dialectically against the defenders of the idea of a substantial mind, that the mind is a substance, Hume contends that if by the term substance, those philosophers, and he means Descartes, understand something that, quote, may exist by itself, which is close to Descartes' definition of substance, then all perceptions fall under this definition. So you have that in handout 7. All our perceptions are different from each other and from everything else in the universe. They are also distinct and separable and may be considered as separately existent and may exist separately and have no need of anything else to support their existence. They are, therefore, substance as far as this definition explains a substance. And of course, Hume believes that this definition does not explain what is a substance. But if that's your definition, then all perceptions are substance because they can exist by themselves. In the appendix to the treatise, which is a text in which Hume had added some corrections to earlier sections of the treatise, Hume returns to this problem, and you have that passage in handout 8, but for the sake of time, I won't read it. But I will not read it. So he comes again to this idea that perceptions can possibly exist independently of the mind and they can exist by themselves. In all of these passages, and there are more, Hume presents different versions of an argument that leads to the conclusion that perceptions are separable from minds. I will call these arguments the separability argument. And I will devote the next 2 parts of this talk to reconstructing that argument and discussing it. So, to understand the separability argument, we need first to dwell on 4 principles that are important for Hume. And you have those in handout 9. The first, I already mentioned, is the copy principle that states that all our simple ideas are exact copies of antecedent simple impressions. That's well known. The second is that difference implies distinguishability. So if perception P presents different features, then these features may be distinguished from one another. The separability principle goes a little bit farther and says that if perception P presents distinct features, then these features can be separately conceived. We can conceive one without the other and the other without the first one, right? Finally, the conceivability principle states that if it is possible to have separate conceptions of P and Q, or to separately conceive P, then P may exist separately. What we nowadays call the copy principle, so number one here, is, according to Hume, the first principle of his science of human nature. So he takes it to be very basic for all his philosophy. It is a well-known Humean principle that plays a crucial role in Hume's most important arguments, and that he takes to be founded on empirical evidence. And I suppose that you more or less know already about this principle. The other three principles are presented several times in the treatise and in the abstract. And you have some examples in handout 10 that I won't read it, but that support the way I presented it before, the reconstruction I offered here of the four principles. So if you want to have a look, they're there. So the inference from this difference to distinguishability is to be understood as the move from an objective feature of a given perception to an epistemic possibility. If what is presented to the mind exhibit different features, then it is in principle possible for the mind to distinguish these features, even if, for contingent reasons, we may not actually be in the position of actually distinguish them. For we may fail to notice existing difference due to perceptual or technological limitations in our observations. So the principle states that in optimal or transparent epistemic conditions, every difference can be noticed. The separability principle simply states that when distinct features are identified in a single but complex perceptions, it is psychologically possible to have separate conceptions of each of these features, so that our psychology is such that we can think of one and not of the other, and the other and not of the first one. So far, the direction of inference goes from how things are in the world, so things present differences and we can distinguish them, and then we can have separate conceptions of them, to the way we might conceive them. But the conceivability principle surprisingly moves in the other direction. From a fact about what we might conceive things, we infer something about a possible state of the world. So because I have the capacity of have separate conception of P and Q, then I infer somehow that those two things may exist separately in the world. So the inference goes from how we think to how the world might be. This principle was widely accepted by early modern philosophers, and Hume took it as, I quote him, an established maxim in metaphysics. Since Hume did not explicitly argue for the principle, one might think that he took it as an unproblematic independent assumption. However, it is unclear on what grounds Hume could endorse it. Consider, by contrast, Descartes' understanding of the conceivability principle. In Principles, the book Principles, Descartes claims that, I quote Descartes right now, we can perceive that two substances are really distinct simply from the fact that we can clearly and distinctly understand one apart from the other. End of quote. We are licensed, that's my voice, to draw this inference because, I quote Descartes again, we are certain that God can bring about anything of which we have a distinct understanding. End of quote. In other words, whenever we are capable of separating two things in thought, we can know with certainty that God, at least, has the same capacity. Since, unlike us, God has also the power to bring about anything he conceives, we thereby know with certainty that he has the power to separate in reality what we can only separate in thought. Hence, entities that we can separate in thought may, if God wills it, also exist separately. So that's what justifies the inference from conceivability to possibility for the cards. That principle, that inference from conceivability to possibility, was indeed an established maxim in metaphysics. However, Hume, the great infidel, could not invoke the main reason that justified this principle for philosophers like Descartes, namely God's omniscience and omnipotence. By borrowing the principle from previous metaphysicians without endorsing their way of grounding it, Hume might seem to turn the inference from conceivability to possibility into an unjustified a priori metaphysical principle, something that would, of course, weaken what I call the separability argument. Appearances notwithstanding, the conceivability principle can be justified on strictly Humean grounds. The conceivability principle can be shown to derive from the conjunction of the above presented principles, the copy principle, the distinguishability principle, and the separability principle, with the conjunction with all these principles, what I will label the existence claim. So, and you have that in handout 11. In Treatise 1228, some Hume claims, and I quote him, and you have that in the handout, the idea of existence is the very same with the idea of what we conceive as existent. I read this as follows, and you have the existence claim in the handout, I hope. 11, yes. So, to conceive P is the same as to conceive the existence of P. Hume's existence claim is supported by an argument that shows how it is derived from and hence is consistent with the copy and the separability principles. And you have that reconstructed argument in handout 12. So the first premises is the copy principle, namely that all our simple ideas are exact copies of simple impressions. The second is the separability principle. If perceptions P and Q present distinct features, then P and Q can be separately conceived. Then 3, the idea of P's existence is either a copy of a simple impression distinct from a P impression, or it cannot be distinguished from the idea of P. So either I have a separate impression of the existence of P, distinct from the impression of P, or it cannot be, the idea of P's existence cannot be distinguished from the idea of P. Then he claims that as a matter of fact, that's a matter of empirical fact for Hume, there are no impressions of existence distinct from the impressions of what we take to be existent. So we don't have a separate sensation of existence. I see Deborah and I see her as existing, and in both cases, it's the same thing that I see, or the same person, rather.
So far, so good.
So far, so good, yeah. So if that's the case, then the idea of P's existence, if there are no impressions of existence, the idea of P's existence cannot be distinguished from the idea of P. And if the idea of P's existence cannot be distinguished from the idea of P, then they are not distinct ideas. Therefore, and that's the existence claim, to conceive P is the same as to conceive the existence of P. And that argument you will find it in the section on the idea of existence and of external existence in the treatise. At first sight, the argument seems fallacious and based on confounding the existence of the perception with the existence of the thing perceived. After all, there seems to be a clear difference between entertaining the idea of a dragon and believing that such dragon, or any other, exists outside my imagination. However, Hume preempts this objection. So first, he claims that our experience of existence is first and foremost the experience of having perceptions. I quote him, there is no impression nor idea of any kind of which we have any consciousness or memory that is not conceived as existent. Accordingly, end of quote, it is impossible to conceive perception P and conceive that perception as not existing. According to Hume, the farther we can go on negating existence is to conceive P, which implies its existence, and then to, I quote him, exclude the object, namely P, from all time and places in which it is supposed not to exist. So I have to think of P and then deny that P exists anywhere at any time, right? But I have first to have that perception, and the perception exists. Furthermore, since for him nothing is present to the mind except perceptions, the only existence with which we are directly acquainted is that of perceptions. Therefore, any idea of external existence, as opposed to the existence of perceptions, qua perceptions, would still need to be derived from an impression, if it is to be different from that which we conceive as existent. However, as Hume points out, impressions of existence are nowhere to be found. That's in the premise 4. So we don't have any as a matter of empirical fact. Now, if we cannot derive a separate idea of existence from experience, it is a fortiori impossible to form the separate idea of the external existence of something. And he would say that the confusion is, so if the objection is that the argument is fallacious, or it's based on a fallacy, he would argue that the confusion lies not in the argument, but rather in the objection. For to say that the argument supporting the existence claim confuses the external existence of things with the existence of perception, when the argument was you're confusing, you're imagining a dragon with believing that there is a dragon outside. So that objection if that's your objection, you're presupposing that we can form a separate idea of external existence that is not derived from any impression. Now, this assumption is ruled out by the copy principle, because you have all our ideas are copied from antecedent impressions, and there are no impressions of existence that come separately from the things we conceive as existent. So the objector has either to reject the copy principle or come up with a better account of the origins of the origin of our ideas, or to retract the objection. So the objection seems commonsensical, but for Hume it's not, because if our idea of existence it's only derived from our experience of perceptions, then and we don't have a separate impression of existence, then we cannot have a separate and a distinct idea of external existence. However, the acceptance of the copyance and separability principle implies that we have, I quote him, no idea of existence distinguishable and separable from the idea of particular objects. End of quote. Our idea of existence is necessarily derived from the experience of particularly existing perceptions, and hence cannot be taken to represent something distinct from the existence of particular perceptions. Despite the air of paradox, Hume's existence claim is not at odds with the ordinary distinction between the existence of something in thought and its existence outside the mind. Our idea of existence is exemplified by any particular perception. If we need to think of any of these particular perceptions as existing externally and not only in our imagination, we only need, or so Hume claims, I quote him, to attribute to them different relations, connections, and durations. So we attribute to them a spatial temporal location, a causal role, and so on, and then we think of them as external existences. Thus, for Hume, there are two senses, one fundamental and the other derivative, in which things can be said to exist. In the fundamental sense, like in Berkeley's essay Is Percipi, to exist just as to be a perception. In the derivative sense, to exist externally is to be a perception to which spatiotemporal and causal relations are assigned. The point is explicitly and clearly stated in the section of the treatise entitled precisely The Idea of Existence and of External Existence, in treatise 1 to 6. Unfortunately, Hume does not always take care of distinguishing these two senses of the expression existence when discussing the existence or non-existence of something elsewhere in his writings. This lack of care on his part causes important damage in the way many of his philosophical tenets and arguments are understood. Let's call these two senses, the first, existence as perception, and the second, external existence, as in handout 13. So, existence as perception I define as it's when an object or perception exists as perception solely by virtue of it being conceived or present to the mind. In the case of external existence, an object or perception exists externally if it exists as perception and spatiotemporal and causal relations are assigned to it. So with this distinction in mind, we need to reformulate the existence claim. So the existence claim, we should read it now as stating that on handout 14, to conceive P is the same as to conceive the existence as perception of P. Also, paying attention to these two different senses of existence helps us see some important model consequences. And you have those in handout 15. It is impossible, the first is that it is impossible for an object to be conceived and not to exist as perception. Because if it's conceived, it exists as a perception. The second is that external existence implies existence as perception, but not the other way around. So the third is that if an object actually exists as perception, then it possibly exists externally. And that's the way the conservability possibility inference goes. And the fourth is that if an object possibly exists externally, then it actually also exists as perception. For example, if we return to dragons, dragons actually exist as perception when we conceive them. If they exist as perception, then they also possibly exist externally. If it is imaginable to assign spatiotemporal locations to them and to imagine them involved in at least some causal interactions with other beings or entities. For example, we can imagine dragons existing externally, if we can imagine them spitting fire, eating, and so on. However, we do not believe that they actually exist externally because we have not seen any. There are no credible reports of dragons existing externally, and our present knowledge of the laws of nature renders their external existence empirically impossible. So, with this distinctions in mind, we can now reconstruct the separability argument with more detail. The first, so you have that in handout 16. So we still have the difference implies distinguishability principle. Perception P has different features, then these features can be distinguished. The separability principle that states that if they can be distinguished, then we can have separate conceptions of them. Now the existence claim reformulated is that to conceive P is the same as to conceive the existence as perception of P. Then we have now a new version of the conceivability implies possibility principle, since to conceive P is for P to exist as perception, and to exist as perception is to possibly exist externally. Then, if it is possible to have a separate conception of P, it is possible for P to have a separate external existence. Since there is a difference between the mind and its perception, it is possible to distinguish a perception P from the mind or collection of perceptions in which P actually is. And 6 it is possible to conceive a perception separately from the mind, so we can have a separate conception of one perception and independently of conceiving at the same time the mind in which it belongs. So we can do that. Therefore, for all perceptions such as P, it is possible that they exist externally and hence separately from the mind and from anything else. And in other words, all perceptions are possibly non-mental. 8, if perceptions are possibly non-mental, then being related to a mind is neither a necessary condition for their existence as perceptions nor for their external existence. And the conclusion is, therefore, perceptions are mind-independent entities. The claim that perceptions are possibly non-mental in premise 7 can easily be misunderstood given the previously noted ambiguity surrounding the expression being mental or being non-mental. I suggest that it should be understood having in mind sense D of being mental. That is to say, it should be understood as a statement that perceptions being really distinct from the mind may, for that reason, be contingently related mental or unrelated non-mental to a mind. Notice, though, that the possibility involved here is absolute or metaphysical possibility, not empirical or real possibility. In the abstract, Hume specifies that, and I quote him, whatever we conceive is possible, and he adds, at least in a metaphysical sense, end of quote. Meaning that conceivability inferences do not establish the real or empirical possibility of what we conceive. The point is simply that since I can conceive of something, say an apple perception, without conceiving its relation to my or any other mind, then it is absolutely or metaphysically possible for this apple perception to exist externally without a connection to a mind. Even if, in my experience, perceptions are actually related to my mind, it remains absolutely possible for each of them to exist externally and hence independently from my mind. In other words, perceptions do not need to be in the mind in order to exist, and they can be mental in the weak sense of being presently or actually related to a mind, while remaining mind independent. Also, in order to properly understand the claim that perceptions are mind independent, it is important first to distinguish between different senses in which that dependency can be understood. And you have that in handout 13. 13? No, 17, I would say. 17. So you have one way is what I call ontological dependency. B is ontologically dependent on A if and only if it's absolutely impossible for B to exist otherwise than as a part, a state, or a mode of A. Metaphysical dependency is when B is metaphysically dependent on A if and only if, again, if the existence of A necessitates the existence of B. And causal dependency is when B is causally dependent on A if and only if, or A causes B. The separability argument, as well as Hume's skeptical attacks on the very idea of a substantial mind, clearly entail that perceptions are not ontologically dependent on the mind. If we read Hume as claiming that the mind is a mere bundle of collections or collection of different perceptions, this account certainly implies that perceptions stand in a part-whole relation to the mind and are constitutive of it. However, it doesn't follow therefrom that it's impossible for perceptions to exist externally without the bundle. So, on the bundle view of the mind is ontologically dependent on perceptions, but not the other way around. Perceptions are not ontologically dependent on the mind. The conceivability principle states that if it's possible to conceive B separately from A, then it is possible for A to exist externally without A. Accordingly, the separability argument should be read as implying that perceptions are not metaphysically dependent on the mind either. It is not worthy, however, that the argument does so. The argument, it follows from the argument that they are neither ontologically dependent nor metaphysically dependent on the mind. But the argument doesn't rule out that perceptions be ontological and metaphysically independent of the mind while remaining causally dependent on it. I will now discuss this possibility. So here's a possible objection to my reconstruction of the separability argument. It concerns not that so much the conclusion, but the scope of its conclusion. Recall that the separability argument only concludes that perceptions are neither metaphysical nor ontologically dependent on the mind or on anything else, without ruling out that they might be causally dependent on it. In that case, one could concede the metaphysical possibility that they existed independent of the mind without granting the causal or empirical possibility of the mind independence of perception. Insofar as this argumentative move is successful, the separability argument has not convincingly challenged the mentalistic assumption. It only says that, well, it's absolutely possible that they exist, they have independently of any mind, but as a matter of fact, that's never the case, and it's empirically impossible. So the mentalistic assumption holds in that case, at least in one version. But the move is not successful. Hume believes, of course, that perceptions are causally dependent on other perceptions. Hume also claims that reciprocal causal relations between perceptions are, in a manner, constitutive of the mind. The mind, as a system, as he calls it, certainly depends on these causal relations. But Hume doesn't assert that perceptions are causally dependent on the mind as such. The reason is simply that the relation of constant conjunction, which is required for causal attributions, never obtains between any particular perception and the mind as a whole. For when we observe the mind by introspection, there is nothing constant in it over and above different perceptions that are, as Hume puts it, in perpetual flux and movement. And it is this, I quote Hume again, successive perception only that constitute the mind, end of quote. So there's never the case that one particular perception stands in a constant conjunction relation to the mind as such, because the mind is never the same. So Hume compares the mind to a republic in which, I quote him, the several members are united by the reciprocal ties of government and subordination and give rise to other persons who propagate the same republic in the incessant changes of its parts, end of quote. The causal interaction between the members, of course, constitute the Commonwealth. But following the analogy, it is not causally impossible for each of these members to emigrate from the republic. Neither it is causally impossible for particular perceptions in a mind to sever some of its relations, move abroad, and, as Reid feared, be set adrift in the world without a friend or connection, without a rag covered of nakedness. So another objection, so they're not causally dependent on the mind either. Another objection regarding the scope of the separability argument concerns passions and emotions. Hume characterizes passions and emotions as being impressions of reflection or secondary impressions. It is indeed harder to accept the separability of impressions of reflections, for it certainly sounds absurd, for instance, to think of a desire or a feeling of pride existing separately without anyone experiencing them. How the obvious dependence of passions and emotions in a subject having them can be reconciled with the separability argument? Or should we rather exclude impressions of reflections, that is, emotions and passions, from the scope of the separability claim? The answer, I submit, is the following. The textual evidence clearly shows that the separability argument applies to all perceptions, and hence passions and emotions must be included in its scope. However, the separability of impressions of reflection is compatible with acknowledging their greater dependence on the person experiencing them. Hume explicitly acknowledged that the fact that passions and emotions are more subjective than other perceptions, and you have that in handout 18. He says, our affections depend more upon ourselves and the internal operations of the mind than any other impression. So Hume doesn't think the dependence relation here to be absolute, but only greater than of other impressions. He's thus taking that dependence to be causal rather than metaphysical or ontological. And the dependence is on specific acts of mind, not on the mind as a whole. Also, as I've already argued, the causal dependence of perceptions on the mind is compatible with the separability argument. So, nonetheless, the passage I have just quoted underwrites a significant difference between impressions of reflection and all other perceptions. Although impressions of reflection remain mind-independent in the metaphysical and the ontological sense, they are causally dependent on the operations of the mind and the body of the person experiencing them. By Justin. The independence of impressions of reflection from the person experiencing them is thus not unthinkable, but it is unbelievable. I'm concluding soon. So I hope to have shown that there is sufficient textual evidence to support the claim that Humean perceptions are mind-independent. I also hope to have convinced you that my reconstruction of the argument is based entirely on Humean principle and doesn't rely on unargued for assumptions or a priori metaphysical principles. Assuming my hopes are not entirely unfounded, perhaps you will now agree with Reid and me, myself, that Humean perceptions are indeed adrift in the world. Unlike Reid, however, I don't believe that this conclusion is absurd. Rather, accepting it invites us to radically revise our assumptions about Hume's philosophy of mind. But this is a topic for another occasion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Let's see. One second, I'm just okay.